Welcome back, everybody, for this, our final edition of our text study for the Lenten season of joining Jesus at the margins. And today we're going to bump ahead even further than we did last week to the Easter story. So we are doing this recognizing that I am recording this on Monday of Holy Week. We have a lot of difficult texts to walk through throughout this week, including the Maundy Thursday experience, the Good Friday experience, of course. But because these videos are made in conjunction with the text that we'll be using on Sunday, we're going to read the Easter story. So I invite you just to kind of bracket the Lenten season for a moment. Let's look at the Easter story, and then you can take the Lenten season back off the shelf and experience it this week, which I truly hope you get a chance to do. So you can see what we've been throughout this Lenten season. And you can see the last weekend we looked at the entry into Jerusalem. Today we'll look at the resurrection story from Luke. It's another story that's told in all four Gospels. And so what I want to do is start with a little bit of side-by-side comparison, look at some similarities and some differences. There are some vast differences in the way that the different Gospels tell the story. And you can really see that when you start with the Gospel of Mark. I'm from the school that thinks the Gospel of Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke were writing with Mark in hand, and to some extent answering Mark, especially this story. I think John had access to Mark as well, but I think John is writing John's own way. So in Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8, we have the resurrection story. Most biblical scholars believe that based on the oldest manuscripts we have available to us, this is the end of Mark's gospel. Okay, so verses 1 through 8 would mark the end of Mark's gospel in the earliest forms that we have it. We don't have the original form of any book from any Bible. But what we have here in Mark are the earliest forms, the earliest editions, and they end with verse 8. So if you go to your Bible and turn to chapter 16, you'll see that there's more than just 8 verses. Often, however, they'll either begin with an asterisk, and at the bottom there'll be an annotation explaining that what follows seems to have been added later, or they might be in brackets, even double brackets, because it looks like more than one person has tried to end this gospel. We'll talk about that a little more as we go along, of why someone might have gone to the trouble to try to modify the end of Mark's gospel. In Matthew, the Easter story is the first 10 verses, but that's not the end of Easter Day. There are verses 11 through 15 that also have something that happened on Easter. In Mark's gospel, the angel tells the women, "Go tell Peter and the others that Jesus will meet you in Galilee, as he said." And it ends with the phrase, "They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." That's the unsatisfactory original ending of Mark's gospel. In Matthew's gospel, the angel tells the women that same thing, and they go and tell the disciples exactly what the angel told them. So if Matthew was written after Mark, then Matthew is fixing Mark's ending to some extent. And then in verses 16 through 20, the disciples actually go to Galilee, and that's where they meet Jesus, and that's where when Jesus is ascending, and that's where Jesus gives them what we call the Great Commandment, or the Great Commission. So in some ways, I think Matthew is another form of fixing that unsatisfactory ending of Mark's gospel. And the reason that's important is that Werner Kelber has argued that for Mark, the disciples have failed because they were supposed to go back to Galilee. And as the book of Acts tells you, the disciples basically set up camp in Jerusalem. Luke says they were worshiping God continually in the temple. So in Luke's gospel, they're in Jerusalem. And for Mark, that's not where they're supposed to be. They're supposed to be in Galilee. This is supposed to be a peasant movement, and it's supposed to be Galilean-centric rather than temple-centric or Jerusalem-centric. So it's different theologies playing out in the way that the stories are told. They all ascribe to the resurrection. The differences are having to do with how the disciples responded to the resurrection. So in Matthew, you've got two stories, the original Easter morning story, and then later on Easter Day between verses 11 and 15. And then the last 5 verses, 16 through 20, they're in Galilee. There's no time marker there. It looks like, right after that, this happened. But it takes some time to get from Jerusalem to Galilee. So we imagine that those last few verses, while they're not separated by a timestamp, they probably are not taking place on Easter Day. That would be really, really hard. And then in Luke's story, we're going to circle back and look at this more. But you have the original resurrection story. And then in verses 13 through 35, you have a second Easter story, only instead of Easter morning as the sun is arising, this story takes place later in the day. It's called The Road to Emmaus. And it specifically mentions that it's time to turn in, to find an inn or a place to stay, or maybe they reach someone's home, and it's time to get off the road because nightfall is happening. And so it's an Easter story, as it were, but it's not an Easter morning story. And then there's an aftermath that we'll see a little bit more of in just a moment. But there's a lot happening on Easter Day, but the first 12 verses are about Easter morning. And then in John's Gospel, it's some great storytelling in John's Gospel. So again, the first 10 verses are about Easter morning. The first thing that happens, it's an appearance to Jesus, of Jesus to Mary. But later that day, Jesus will appear to the other disciples in a locked room. And you remember that story because that's when Jesus makes an appearance, and they are, Thomas is not there. And so they tell Thomas later, and he doubts. And then a week later, Jesus appears again, and that's when Thomas believes. So 3 segments of a story. The initial story of going to the tomb. The second story, in the initial story, Mary Magdalene goes, she comes back, she tells the people, and Peter and John go to the tomb. And that's the first part of the Easter story. After that, Mary goes back to the tomb, and that's when she meets Jesus. So that's the second segment I have here, verses 11 through 18. And then 19 through 23 is that night when the disciples are locked into a room out of fear, and Jesus appears in the room. So you've got very many different ways of telling this story. Lots of things happening on Easter Day, but all 4 Gospels agree that on Easter morning, someone feminine goes to the tomb and discovers that Christ has risen. And so that's true in all the stories. How it's heard, how it's broken apart is different in each story. For example, you could ask the question, who went to the tomb? And here's what I want you to hear. Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene. Mary from Magdala. Mary the Magdalene. Or as they say in Latin America, Mary Magdalena. Okay? Mary Magdalene is in all 4 stories as going to the tomb. She is the only one in all 4 stories as going to the tomb. So Mary Magdalene is the one who went to the tomb. All 4 of the gospel witnesses agree on that. Okay? In Mark's gospel, she's not alone. There's Mary Magdalene, and there's another Mary called the mother of James. There's some argument whether this is also the mother of Jesus, because tradition tells us that James, the brother of our Lord, was one of the apostles and the head of the church and so forth. So there's a James who is named as an apostle. One of them is the son of Zebedee. One is the son of Alphaeus. But there's also a James who's the head of the church. And, with so many Jameses, and not every case are they identified as to exactly who they are and their lineage, and we don't have pictures. Some people have felt that this mother of James, that became a popular way of speaking about the mother of Jesus. I don't know. Maybe it was. Maybe it was a woman named Mary whose son was named James. So we have Mary Magdalene, this Mary, the mother of James, and a woman named Salome, who I think is related to one of the officials, and therefore was a woman of means that helped to support Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, you had Mary Magdalene and the Mary who is called the other Mary. Which of the other Marys? We don't know. I just think that's sad nomenclature for somebody. But Luke does it as well. You've got they. Initially, they went to the tomb. We're going to read that more closely. Then later, it named as Mary Magdalene, Joanna, not Salome, but Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and then others. And then later in the story, Peter will go to the tomb. And in John's gospel, it's Mary Magdalene, all by herself, who goes to the tomb. She sees it's empty. She goes back and she tells Peter and John. They go to the tomb, and then Mary returns to the tomb. So even the simple question of who were the first witnesses of the empty tomb, there's just no consistency except for Mary Magdalene. You might also ask, so when they get there, whether it's Mary and the other Mary, or Mary and Mary, or Mary and Joanna and Salome and all these other women, when Peter and John get there, what do they find? What do they find? Well, in Mark's gospel, there's no body in there. They look and there's no body. They come to anoint a dead body. So, no body, but there is a young man in a white robe, as he's described. Now, we presume this is an angel. Some people have connected this young man to another young man who makes a cameo appearance in the arrest story. When Jesus was arrested, Mark says that, and there was another young man there who they tried to grab him, and he ran naked from their grip. So they grabbed his robe, and he ran out of his robe and kept running. Some people feel that naked young man escaping arrest in the garden and this young man in a white robe here are actually Mark, the writer. I don't know who started that idea. I think it's highly speculative. I do not invest in it, although my name's Mark, and it'd be kind of cool. But this is the second young man with relation to the robe that's mentioned in Mark's story this late in the story. So it's kind of a curious thing. Not identified as an angel, but we often assume that. And why? Well, because in Matthew's gospel, there is an angel. There's an earthquake which opens the tomb, and there's an angel sitting on the stone. So we retrospectively, or at least otherspectively, imagine that the young man in the white robe in Mark's gospel must be an angel as well. Luke describes two men in dazzling clothes, dazzling apparel. Sounds very much like an angel to the extent that dazzling robes seem to be a way of describing divine or heavenly beings as opposed to normal people. You know, it's hard to keep a robe white when you're walking dusty roads and so forth. It was a full-time job for fullers to try to make robes white. That was a difficult thing to achieve. in these days. So this is again, we speculate that this is a reference to two angels, but it's two, not just one, as it was in Mark and Matthew. And then in John, there's no one in there. There are the wrappings. There's the face cloth. Later, when Mary comes back, she sees two angels in the tomb. So, what exactly did they find there? Take your pick. There's some divine presence, it would seem, if that's how we can read the young man in a white robe and the two men in dazzling clothes. There's no body. That is the consistent theme. No body. Not nobody, but no body in the tomb. Because that is exactly what they were expecting to find. A body that had been bloodied and bruised and tormented and put to death. And because it was the Sabbath, they didn't have time to wash the body and clean it thoroughly. They didn't have time to apply ointments and unguents and the kinds of things that help to preserve a body. And that's what they're prepared to do as they approach the tomb, and there's no body. So then the question is, how did they react? How did they react? Well, you heard me say a moment ago that when the young man in the white robe told the women to go tell Peter and the others to go to Galilee, they didn't. Mark's gospel ends with the phrase, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's the worst climax you ever heard to a story, right there. In Matthew's gospel, the Marys, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, they go and they do tell, and then they see Jesus and they worship. They fall down at Jesus' feet and worship. So, where they're afraid in Mark's gospel, the women are bold and the first witnesses to the resurrection in Matthew's gospel. In Luke, as we'll see in a moment, the women go back, they tell the story, and the men do not believe them. And then in John's story, everybody's running. Mary runs to get Peter and John. Peter and John run to the tomb. It's pretty fascinating. Okay, so now let's get to our story from Luke's gospel. We're going to go through this rather quickly. I'm just going to point out a lot of things, and then on Wednesday we can discuss them more. Let's start with the reading. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. So there's Luke's Easter story right there. All right, so this is the first story of Easter. The other things will happen later in the day. It takes place on the first day of the week, which is often referred to in the scriptures as the first of Sabbaths. The stone had been rolled away. No agency as to who did that. No earthquake in Luke's telling. No body in the tomb. There are two men in dazzling apparel. We'll talk about that on Wednesday a bit. And they asked this profound question. Why do you seek the living among the dead? We're not going to explore that much this week because I think I want to explore that on Sunday. Also, the two men in the dazzling clothes tell them, remember what he said to you when he was in Galilee. Okay? So remembering is a very important part of this story. We'll explore that a lot on Wednesday, the role of remembering. And what he had told them, they say, is that the Son of Man must be handed over. Must be handed over. That word must is a translation of a verb that we talk about quite often in our text studies, the verb deo, which is often, I think, reduced to the word must. I think that's dismissing the severity of this term. The word deo means to be bound to something, and to be bound to it, even fastened to it by a chain, as it were. It's a word about destiny, something that not just must happen, but is bound for someone to happen. So just think the word destiny when you see that. Because in his disclosures, when Jesus tells the disciples, while he's in Galilee, that he's going to suffer and die, he uses that same term. I like to translate it, it is necessary. This is something that necessarily is bound to happen. This is a statement about destiny. Jesus had told them in Galilee he'd be handed over. The word handed over is sometimes translated betrayed, that he would be crucified, and on the third day to rise up. So all of this has already been told to them. The third day would be counting Friday. So Jesus is killed on Friday, that's the first day. And then Saturday is the second day, Sunday is the third day. And then critically, the women remembered his words. So this is, the word member refers to body parts, and to be dismembered is to lose a body part. To be remembered is to reattach yourself to something. And they are remembering, they are reattaching themselves to the words that Jesus had said. It's an act of faithfulness to remember the words of Christ. All right, then the women go and they report all these things to the men who are gathered there, to the 11 and all the rest. So Luke has a way of, kind of pointing out certain people within the crowd, but then including the rest of the crowd. He'll do that with the women too. He names Mary, Joanna, the other Mary, and the rest of the women who were with them. And this is the really challenging, difficult part of this resurrection story in Luke. The apostles. These are the apostles. They will go on to become, for Luke and for the book of Acts, the heads of the church, right? They're the apostles. They were with Jesus when he said in Galilee that he would be handed over, that it was bound for him to be handed over, crucified, and to rise. The apostles, the leaders of the church. Their first reaction to the Easter story was to dismiss it as an idle tale. Now, that's either an act of severe patriarchy, because it's women telling this story, and, they probably looked at each other like, how women can be, right? They're hysterical. They're imagining things. Their emotions are running away with them. I don't know if that was it. Maybe they just hadn't reattached themselves to what they had heard, hadn't remembered. Maybe the cross and the death of Jesus took the wind out of their sails. I think that's what happened to Thomas in John's gospel. Maybe they had been so disappointed they could not believe again. For whatever reason, whether we sympathize with them or sneer in their direction, as I am wont to do in this story, they dismiss the women's words. So they hear the Easter story and dismiss it. That's their first reaction. I think that's another thing we should hold on to and think about on Wednesday. But one of the men, at least, and I don't know if this was immediately or after a while, maybe his conscience started working on him, maybe he started wondering, gosh, could it be true that Christ is no longer dead? Where might I have heard that before? I don't know if it's immediate. I don't know if it's kind of a regretful action later that they had treated all these women so badly. This is a lot of testimonies. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, you're supposed to believe what you hear. And that's why we've got all these women being named. And but I want to at least give a half of a kudo here, a one-hand clap for Simon Peter, because Peter got up and went to the tomb to see it for himself. And he saw and he marveled. He didn't remember. He didn't believe. Those are other words that are often used to describe people when it comes to the resurrection. But he marveled. And that might be a step in the right direction. So we'll discuss not only the resurrection story, but the immediate responses to the resurrection story on Wednesday. And we'll start with any questions you have about our side-by-side comparisons, as well as any questions you have about this story in Luke's gospel itself. But that's it for now. We will be back in this building on Thursday for our Maundy Thursday service here at St. Mark. That's at 6:30. If you're part of our congregation, I certainly welcome you to come be part of that. On Easter weekend, we have worship at 5 o'clock on Saturday. And don't forget that on Sunday, our worship times are different. We're worshiping at 9 o'clock and 10:30 on Easter. So if I don't see you on Wednesday for our discussion, then I certainly hope to see you either Thursday, Saturday, or Sunday in worship. All right? Thank you. Bye.